un poco. Hola, ¿qué tal? Bienvenidos de vuelta. Ya estamos en el tercer bloque de este primer día del Congreso Internacional de Educación para el Desarrollo Sustentable. Venimos saliendo de una jornada de paneles muy interesante, de muy buena concurrencia. Ya promediamos los 50 auditores por panel, con mucha interacción por el canal de YouTube. Eh, Así que estamos muy entusiasmados por esto y ahora se nos viene uno de nuestros panelistas principales, un gran escritor, y para eso hemos invitado también a nuestro director, Gonzalo Valdivieso, director del Campus Villarrica de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, quien hará una introducción a Richard para que podamos pasar a ver su ponencia. Gonzalo.
Gracias, Martín. Saludos, buenos días a todos los que están conectados. Buenas tardes a los que están en Europa y good morning a Richard, que está en California bien temprano en la mañana. Quiero agradecer y felicitar a todo el equipo que ha estado trabajando, al comité académico del Congreso, a todas las personas que están desarrollando presentaciones durante estos 3 días, a las instituciones con las que estamos trabajando en este segundo Congreso Internacional de Educación para el Desarrollo Sustentable, que es una de las líneas de trabajo muy importante para el Campus Villarrica de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. Y tenemos el placer de poder tener hoy día como keynote speaker, como una de las presentaciones principales de este Congreso, a Rachel Louv. Richard es mundialmente conocido, es periodista, autor de 10 libros en temáticas vinculadas al trabajo, a la educación, a los niños, a la relación con la naturaleza, a la importancia que tiene esas temáticas. Su libro mundialmente conocido, Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder, el último niño o niña en los bosques y lo que significa este desorden de falta de naturaleza, ha marcado un precedente y ha sido muy importante para la conversación sobre la importancia de la relación de la naturaleza y los niños, de la naturaleza y las personas, la naturaleza y el ser humano, pero con un foco muy importante en la formación de los niños. Tiene, por supuesto, otros libros sobre los principios de la naturaleza, la vitamina N, la vitamina de la naturaleza, su último libro, Cómo nos llama la naturaleza, el Wild Calling, cómo conectar los animales y transformarlos como parte de nuestra vida y también salvarlos a ellos. Sus libros han sido traducidos a más de 22 idiomas. Él ha sido muy importante para lanzar un movimiento internacional que conecta a las familias, a los niños y en la naturaleza. Es cofundador y presidente emérito de una organización non-profit sin fines de lucro, Children and Nature Network. Ha recibido innumerables reconocimientos por su labor, incluyendo una medalla de honor de la National Audubon Society, otros reconocimientos muy importantes, como una medalla del presidente Jimmy Carter, de Sir David Attenborough, disculpen la pronunciación, y otros galardones, tanto en Estados Unidos como fuera de Estados Unidos. Normalmente Richard tiene la posibilidad de desarrollar conferencias alrededor del mundo y hoy día tenemos la posibilidad de tenerlo con nosotros. Ha desarrollado conferencias en la American Academy of Pediatrics National Conference, en el White House Summit on Environmental Education, en el Congreso de New Urbanism, en el International Health Park Conference en Melbourne, Australia, en Friends Nature Conference en Beijing, China. Y hoy día tenemos la posibilidad de tenerlos con nosotros. Louv ha escrito en numerosos medios de comunicación y por supuesto participado también en distintas actividades de televisión. Richard is really a great pleasure and an honor to have you here with us today. And we are going to have this your conference. Vamos a tener la presentación de Richard, and then we're going to have a little time, 30, 40 minutes, to have some conversation. Vamos a tener también la posibilidad de tener una conversación con él. Entonces, voy a invitar a la audiencia que a través del canal YouTube pueda ir haciendo preguntas. Nosotros vamos a recopilar esas preguntas, vamos a juntarlas y vamos a poder después tener un rato de conversación con Richard. Richard, it's really a pleasure to have you here with us. Thank you very much for being today with us.
Thank you. It's an honor to be speaking with you. And educators, I think, particularly those who are focused on the health of the planet, as well as the health of their students and the health of the families that they come from, are doing sacred work in the broadest sense of that. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I look forward to hopefully answering some questions afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Sí, Richard nos decía que, claro, muchas gracias a toda la audiencia, especialmente a los educadores que están preocupados de la salud y del bienestar de sus estudiantes. Richard, thank you. Now we're going to show your video, and then we're going to have some conversation. Queríamos también agradecer a toda la audiencia, al público que nos está viendo desde toda Latinoamérica y que se ha estado conectando ahora a través de YouTube. Los invitamos ahora a ver el video de Richard, a que hagan sus preguntas y nos vemos a la vuelta entonces.
I'm pleased to have been asked to speak to the Second International Congress for Education for Sustainable Development. I'd like to talk to you about several things today, all related to education, but also to health, not only the health of human beings, but the health of wildlife, the health of all life on Earth, and to the planet itself. A few months ago, last year, we saw a series of images on the television, on YouTube, of animals escaping burning forests in Australia. Some of that happened in my own state of California in the United States. But we saw human beings turning out to rush into the flames, some of them only with the clothes on their back. They'd lost everything. They'd lost their house. And they were rushing into these fires to save wild animals. We saw koala bears climb up on people's knees as they rode in on their bicycles to give these koalas water. We saw people showing the best side of humanity, showing their heart. Much of the world, I think, was moved by those images. And then much of the world moved on, as it always does, on to the next terrible thing. It led me, as I was watching that, as I think it did many, to ask, what's it going to take? What will it take for human beings to finally act in the way that they need to act, to take action on what could be considered the four horsemen of the apocalypse? One of them, obviously, is the climate challenge. Another one is biodiversity collapse. Another one we're experiencing right now is zoonotic pandemics. And I think the fourth one is human loneliness, human disconnection from the natural world, but also from each other as part of the natural world. What will it take to act on those horsemen? One thing I think is to begin to see those four horsemen on one horse. They're actually part of a larger issue that I'll get back to. But after those images appeared out of Australia, a philosopher, an eco-philosopher in Australia who I respect greatly, some of you probably have read his work, Glenn Albrecht, he pointed out that data studies very seldom, if ever, move people to action. We need the studies, we need the science. It's absolutely necessary. We have to have that science, but we've got a lot of data. We've got a lot of data on climate change and on pandemics, and we've got a lot of data on biodiversity collapse and even our own human disconnection. Glenn Albrecht points out that if you look at past social movements that have actually moved people to action, from information to action, and he lists, for example, feminism, the gay rights efforts, to a degree, the civil rights effort in the United States and around the world, human rights around the world. He points out that every one of those causes is based on relationships, on love, not necessarily only on data. Data gets us only so far. Reports, science gets us only so far. And then we have to find another motivation to turn caring into action or knowledge into action. One of those, I think, is love. A deep love for the natural world, a deep love even for each other, even when that's hard. But the other element that I think has been missing in modern environmentalism, to a degree, is imaginative hope. By that, I don't mean blind hope. I mean the ability to envision a world that we'll want to go to. So much of my profession of journalism and so much of conservation and environmentalism and education, understandably, is about the bad news, is about what's coming that makes us afraid, that makes us despair. It's easy to get addicted to that despair. So I'll get back to that in a few minutes. But first I want to talk about something that is hopeful. And I've called it the New Nature Movement. Some people call it the Children in Nature Movement. I've called it that. I prefer the New Nature Movement because it does involve adults as well. But it's the effort to connect children and future generations and their families and their communities to a visceral, to a personal connection to nature, beyond data, to love nature. In 2005, a book of mine was published. It was called Last Child in the Woods. The subtitle of it was Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. Now, I was very clear that that was a kind of a tongue-in-cheek phrase. It wasn't a known medical diagnosis. Now I think perhaps it should be. But I always clarify that this isn't a known medical diagnosis. It is, though, a way to talk about, to open a conversation about this disconnection between the young and the natural world, particularly young children, that we've seen growing for decades. Now, there's some signs that it's turning around. But increasingly, for too many children and young people, nature has become an abstraction. It's become a T-shirt with a slogan on it, with a sea otter picture on the T-shirt. It's become a bumper sticker in a sense. It's become something you care about in the abstract. It's good to care about nature in the abstract. But nothing, I think, replaces that sense of awe and wonder when you first crawl out through the grass to the edge of the yard to where the trees and the rocks start. As it may be a 3-year-old, I can remember this. And turning over a rock and seeing under that rock something that leads you to understand maybe for the first time in your young life that we are not the center of the universe, that there are vast civilizations of other animals, of other plants. There's a whole world of awe and wonder. When Last Child in the Woods came out, I was really kind of stunned at the reaction to it, and obviously pleased, did not expect that. But I was most interested, or among the things I was most interested in, was the fact that religious figures took it seriously. Whether they were liberal or conservative, religious people said that they recognized what I was saying. And I finally came to understand that that's because that all spiritual life, no matter what you call it, no matter what brand, all spiritual life begins with a sense of wonder. And what's one of the first windows into wonder for any human being? How can we shut that window? How can we expect future generations to know themselves if they don't know where they are? How can we shut that window into wonder and awe? For too many children around the world, that has already been shut. And for many more to come, it may be shut, or at least closed much of the time. That's been true of education, too. In the United States, for about a decade, school districts were busy shutting down recess. Many schools were built not even with a playground, a play area, grade schools. Out of this idea that if we sat kids at a desk hour after hour and tested them hour after hour and hour, and didn't let them go outside. In fact, some schools in the United States were built with no windows because there was a theory that somehow looking out the window would distract them from what was really important, what was on that test. Somewhere along the line, certainly in the United States, I can't speak for your countries, but in my country, that was forgotten, the wonder and awe, which is at the root of all the best education. A sense of connection to something beyond us, a sense of connection to where we came from this earth and this universe. This movement has now become international. By movement, I mean there are regional campaigns, not only in the United States, all over the United States, but I've been to Australia, I've been to China. There's a whole new profession now in China, the nature educators, that has really blossomed. There's a recognition in many places. In Brazil, a national campaign was launched a few years ago by some wonderful people who decided that kids there had nature deficit disorder, and they couldn't stand the idea that future generations would not have the connection that so many of us as adults took for granted. Now, that may be surprising. It was surprising to me, in Brazil, with all of that, the Amazon, all of that nature, all that wildness. How could that be? Well, I should probably get out more. I should probably travel more, because I came to understand by going to China and going to Brazil that, what I already understood intellectually, but I really didn't get viscerally yet. That all over the world, people have been urbanizing, moving fast into giant cities. And those cities have grown overnight. Shenzhen in China grew in about 30 years from essentially a fishing village to a giant modern city of, I think it's about 15 million people live there. Overnight. The same thing happened in Brazil and many other countries. It happened to an extent in the United States. And the theory was, the idea was, or the feeling was for much of that time, is that nature was associated with farming and a different way of life, an earlier way of life, and it was associated with poverty. Not for everybody, but for many. Now several generations have gone by, and suddenly the grandparents are telling stories to their grandkids and their own kids. And those stories are starting to make sense of just how important, how elemental, how fundamental a connection to nature is to human development, to child development, all through our lives. And now they're wanting to get that back. We're seeing that in the United States. We're seeing family nature clubs, for instance. These are groups of families that may be afraid to go out in nature by themselves, on a hike by themselves, because there's so much fear of strangers in the United States. So they turn to each other, and they have a list of families that they can call and say, who wants to go to the park on Saturday and take our kids on a hike? And they put out the word, 10, 20, 25, maybe even just 5 families show up, and they have that nature adventure together, and they feel safe because of it. And they're more likely to do it because other families are waiting for them at the park. There are hundreds of those family nature clubs all over the United States, many of them with hundreds, even thousands of families each. San Diego, where I am from, I've since moved outside of San Diego up into the mountains, but in San Diego, the Family Nature Club there started about 4 years. It now, I think, has about 3,000, over 3,000 families as members. That's one club, and there's hundreds of these now. So this movement has also moved into other professions, including medical professions and education. In 2010, I was asked to give the keynote speech to the American Academy of Pediatrics, their national conference. Several thousand pediatricians were in the auditorium. I was pretty surprised to be asked. I mean, really? Nature deficit disorder? And I made my qualification. This is not a known diagnosis, but I was surprised to be asked. And the response was great, was really impressive to me, certainly. Many physicians that I met said they were going to go home and change their practice. One of them was Dr. Robert Czar from Washington, D.C. He went back to D.C. and he began to literally write nature prescriptions to families. Go outside, go to the park, get what I later called vitamin N. Get your vitamin N out there. Then he organized all the other pediatricians in Washington, D.C. to do the same thing. They were all writing nature prescriptions, but they didn't stop there. Then they did a database of all the parks in Washington, D.C., and all the open space, so that the doctor could not only write the prescription, but could turn to the computer and say, there's a park 1.5 blocks from your house, and here's what you can get there. Mainstream medicine is now taking this quite seriously, and with good reason. When I wrote Last Child in the Woods, and again, this book, I think, is riding the crest of a wave that started long before this book was written. I'm not claiming the book. I'd like to think it had something to do with it, but it was there before, but it was nascent. It was all those good people for decades and decades who have been getting kids outdoors, but they've not been getting enough respect. All those teachers who insisted on having outdoor classrooms, but they're not getting enough respect. They didn't then. I think they're starting to. All those medical folks who took, our mother's advice to go outside and play, took that seriously, that was part of being healthy. There are many more of them today. But when I wrote Last Child in the Woods, I could find only about 40 studies that I could cite, both about the deficit, which was growing. I mean, the numbers then, and they're even worse now, about how little time kids spend outdoors. More and more it's on computers and on video games and on their cell phones. More and more kids are growing up in a virtual world. We all know that. But the disappearance of natural play, the disappearance of that kind of freedom, that kind of connection to something beyond ourselves, beyond, the application or the program written by somebody sitting in Silicon Valley eating pizza. There's more to life than that. Nothing wrong with that. I'm not anti-tech. I make very clear, I have in these books that it's not a question of doing away with technology. It's a question of, the more high-tech our lives become, the more nature we need. It's an equation. It's a budgeting issue for families, for schools. The more high-tech our lives become, the more nature we need to balance some of the impact of technology. Along with all of its good impacts, spending time in the virtual world also exacts a great price. We're feeling that more these days. So there were only about 40 studies either showing the gap that was widening, but also showing the great benefits of nature. Some of the early research was about attention deficit disorder, which has been diagnosed at record numbers year after year after year. And the University of Illinois, researchers there, found that when kids in an urban park just walked through trees in an urban park, their symptoms of attention deficit disorder went down significantly. There was a bunch of studies showing up then. There were pioneers out there doing that then, finding out how it affected depression, how more time in nature affected depression and prevented it. But the head of one medical school, at the University of Riverside, told me that there are very few things that can be used both for prevention and for therapy. And nature experience is one of the very few things that he said that can qualify as that. So there were only about 60 studies. This issue of the impact of the natural world on child development and human development throughout our lives had been virtually ignored by the academic world. Since then, the issue has become kind of a growth industry in the academic world. Today, if you go to the Children and Nature Network website, which is childrenandnature.org, which is, that's the nonprofit that grew out of Last Child in the Woods. We've put together a research library of the studies. We've done abstracts of these. There have been independently done abstracts, first by folks at Yale, and then working out of the University of Minnesota, some folks from there. These are abstracts of the studies. Many of these studies are behind firewalls. You can't get to them through the internet or through journals without paying a lot of money. I have a problem with that because so much of this research has been done by public universities, paid for by public taxpayer dollars, but we can't get to them without paying a lot of money. It's only for the few. So we've worked with folks at Yale University of Minnesota. We're very careful not to claim too much for these studies, but there's now over 1,000, and they're coming in at 10, 15, 20 a month from somewhere in the world. And they all pretty much point in the same direction, that nature experience is fundamental to human development, particularly child development, but throughout our lives. Much of that is about health. Much of it is about cognition. There seems to be something about learning outdoors in nature, not for all kids, but for many kids, that really works, that really excites their senses. There's some theories about this, about attention retention, that have been proposed. Kids learn better outside generally. Studies of play spaces, for instance, at schools, natural play areas, as opposed to cement and asphalt playgrounds. the natural play spaces with grass or a garden or a place to roll down on the grass, a place to dig, a place to plant. Those kind of natural play spaces, kids treat each other better generally. They're much more likely to invite kids of a different color, of a different race, of a different culture, of a different gender to play with them on those play spaces. And most importantly, perhaps, kids who play in natural play spaces are far more likely to make up their own games. That's the essence of what's called, as you know, executive function, the brain's ability to make its own rules, to be an entrepreneur, to think creatively, to think independently, whether it's as a person or with a small group. And that's the basis of so much of the creativity we now see in Silicon Valley, we see in technology, in small groups working together. That is one of the reasons I think that there is so much evidence now that nature environments really do stimulate education. So all of this has added up to much more activity in the schools, for instance. I talk about what I call the hybrid mind. It's not, the issue isn't to do away with technology, but to find some balance. And when I say the hybrid mind, I often give the example of a guy I met who teaches people how to become the pilots of cruise ships. And he says he gets two kinds of students. One kind grew up watching television, grew up playing video games, sitting on the couch and doing their iPhones, all of that. That kind of student, he said, has a great skills and talent that I need on my ships. That kind of student is really good at electronics. I've got a lot of electronics on my ships. He said the second kind of student grew up mainly outside or spent a lot of time outside. Maybe their parents were farmers or their parents did a lot of backpacking and hiking and took their kids and camping and all that. He said that kind of student also has great skills that I need. That kind of student can actually tell where the ship is. He wasn't being facetious. He was being literal. He was saying that the sense, the sixth sense that the ship is moving close to the dock, for example, they have developed more spatial senses than the kids who sat on couches playing video games all that time. The next thing he said was the most interesting. He said his ideal student would be a student who has both sets of abilities, both the set of abilities that comes from the virtual and the set of abilities that comes from the natural. That balance, that would be his ideal student. That seems to me, that hybrid mind seems to me to be a pretty good goal for education right now. I believe that the future leaders are the ones who have that skill. They're going to be the nature smart people, the people who have a balance, have achieved a balance between the virtual and the real. One thing I want to talk about before I end this is the issue of loneliness. Remember when I talked about the four horsemen of the apocalypse, the last one was human isolation. It was climate change, biodiversity collapse, zoonotic pandemics, and human isolation. Not only a disconnection from each other, but not only a disconnection from nature, but a disconnection from each other. Medical folks have talked a lot, not only in the United States, but around the world in the last decade, about what some call an epidemic of loneliness, human loneliness. They now believe these medical folks, they now believe that human isolation now ranks with obesity and cigarette smoking as a cause of early death. It's associated not only with suicide, but loneliness is associated with many of the same diseases that are associated with smoking and obesity. One of the studies I saw in human loneliness, and I report in the most recent book, looked in the United States at generational loneliness. They looked at the oldest, the greatest generation, World War II generation, the baby boomers, Generation X, Z, on down. Every generation that was younger was lonelier than the ones that came before in the United States. What does that say about a culture in which the younger you are, the lonely you are? I think that has something to do with nature deficit disorder. I think it has something to do with our disconnection from reality, our disconnection from the natural world. I wrote the most recent book, Our Wild Calling, is about our relationship with other animals, both our pets, but also wild animals. I looked at much of the research, and I interviewed hundreds of people about their experiences, both with their pets and their relationships with their pets, but even more with wild animals, even if it was just a few seconds, the coyote that walks through the backyard. And what they told me, and what the research, I think, suggests, is that there's a limit to how much we can blame on technology. Yes, Facebook and computers do tend to isolate us and push us into silos of belief, of political belief, for instance, where we don't see the same facts that somebody else sees, pushes us into even political isolation. That's true. But I think there's a deeper thing going on here. My hypothesis is that human loneliness, the great rise in human loneliness, is rooted in an even deeper loneliness, which is species loneliness. As a species, we are desperate not to be alone in the universe. Why else would we look for Bigfoot? Why else would we look for intelligent life on other planets when, it may not be a good idea to find that intelligent life on other planets? Why do we need that? Increasingly, human beings, as they have moved away from the natural world, daily, intimate contact, connection with other animals in particular, but also with plants. As we have moved away, I think we have become increasingly, deeply, even pathologically lonely. And that affects everything in our lives. One of the antidotes to that deep loneliness, I believe, is to connect to other life, even if it's just outside our window. We're now experiencing that right now, as we have over the last year with this pandemic. Suddenly, people forced to be indoors, forced to not to be able to go to the park like they thought they could, even if they never went. Suddenly, sometimes you don't know what you've got until it's gone. Now they hunger for it. There's this deep nature hunger right now that has grown to many people's surprise. I think that has to do with that species loneliness. I think the pandemic has brought that to the surface even more than it already was. I want to talk a little bit about what I call Planet Hope and also the human right to nature, but I want to tell you a couple stories. And the folks who present this video may have to trim a little of the video. I may go over my half hour a little bit. Some of the stories that people told me about their encounters with other animals were deeply moving. They all had some common denominators. I collected, 100, 200. I kind of lost track of the number of stories. They're not all in the book. But let me tell you a couple of them. One was from an oceanographer. Among oceanographers, he's a famous oceanographer at Scripps Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla, California. His name is Paul Dayton. He's, I think, approaching or over 80 now. When he was a student at the University of Washington, he tells me this story. He was on the bottom of the ocean one day collecting samples. He was also collecting lunch. He was a starving student. And he was down there with scuba gear on, and he was studying starfish. So he was collecting samples for his research, for his graduate degree. Suddenly he felt come above him. He intuited this. Something very large came above him and stopped. That's usually not a good sign. And he looked up with one eye and he saw a long tentacle coming down. He looked up with the other eye and saw another long tentacle coming down. And at the risk of anthropomorphizing, as he tells me this story, he says he looked up and he realized it was one of those giant octopuses of the Pacific with the 12-foot wingspan. And he said, the octopus looked down, thought that I was a clam, and it came down and got me. And it got him. It wrapped him up in its tentacles, this giant octopus. And he said, people think those tentacles are soft. They're anything but soft. They're very hard. They're impossible to move. They also have photons in the skin. These arms are very strange. These arms also have what amount to independent brains in each of them. And these photons are the cells that we use to see and other animals use to see with. Now, he didn't say that the octopus was seeing him with its arms, but it sure was getting to know him better. And he was trapped. And he was running out of air, he realized, at that very moment. And he relaxed. He did what the prey often does in the mouth of the predator, the gazelle in the mouth of the lion. He relaxed. And the octopus relaxed a little bit. And so with his last strength, he kicked off the bottom of the ocean and he went up and up and up. He and the octopus went up together. The octopus was still around, grabbing him around his. And as they went up in the column of water, the octopus moved around his body. He could feel the razor sharp beak of the octopus coming around his neck until he was looking into the octopus's eye. And he and the octopus looked at each other for a while as they went up. And Paul, again, he's a hardcore scientist, you understand. He said, I think that we made our non-aggression pact. And he smiles when he says that, but he means it. Something happened there that he can't explain. And the octopus pulled back and then let go and moved back. And right then they both hit the top of the water, the surface. And Paul ripped off his mask, gasping for air, totally out of breath. And he looks down and he sees the octopus sinking down below the surface of the water. And he's still making eye contact with the octopus. And as the octopus disappears into the darkness, this is the best part of the story. What does Paul do? He puts his mask back on and he dives after the octopus and swims after it. And then he told me something I didn't get into the book because he told me this later. As they went down, they spiraled around each other as they went down deeper and deeper. And then until Paul ran out of the breath that he had taken and he went back up to the surface. I said, Paul, why in the world did you do that? And again, a hardcore, deeply respected scientist said he did not know exactly why. He used the word spiritual. Something happened there. Now, whether it's spiritual or not, he's not sure. But what he is sure of is that he did not want those moments to end. Something happened there. Second story, a little boy, a woman in Toronto, a mother, told me how her son, 6-year-old, the family had a big dog named Jack. One day she walks into the living room and her son is stretched out on the carpet and her son has his arm around the dog and they're just laying there together. And she hears her son say, "Mommy, I don't have a heart anymore." And she says, "What are you saying?" And her son says, "My heart is in Jack." What is that? That permeability. We felt that. We felt that with other people. That permeability, that place in which something goes back and forth that we don't fully understand, and it happens with animals too. It happens with wild animals as well as pets. The last story, I was on a lake once in my boat outside of San Diego, and I saw on the shore what I thought were two vultures. And I had a little electric motor, so I came up close to them, got within 20 feet of them. They were not vultures. They were two giant golden eagles. You don't usually get within 20 feet of golden eagles. And I stayed there. And then for what seemed like forever, the golden eagles would lean down, take a bite of the carp they were eating, and then look up at me. And then go down. And then look up at me. That went on what seemed like forever. One of the characteristics of the stories I collected was that people feel that they have altered states often when they have these encounters. One of those altered states is that time bends or disappears. Paul Dayton talked about that with the octopus. I felt that with the golden eagles on the shore. I went home later and I told my younger son, who was home from college, "You know, Matthew, whoever I say I am, I'm not. Whoever I really am is who I was in those moments. And I don't have the language to explain that. This is beyond human verbal language." I couldn't speak for the eagles. Maybe they were just trying to decide if I was edible. I'm not sure what happened there, but it felt, as Paul said, and so many other people I interviewed said, that something changed. The purpose of this last book is to search for what that is. There's a great philosopher named Martin Buber. I often have to be careful not to say Justin Bieber. Martin Buber wrote a great essay called I Am Thou. Basically, he said that you and I don't exist. Not really. What exists, he said, is between us. It's right here. It's the relationship. Now, he meant relationship differently than many of us use that word. He thought that what exists between us in relationship is a kind of electricity that some people call God. Again, I don't know. I don't think he really knew. But that's what it feels like. That's what we sense. That he was talking about people. I think that happens with other animals. Maybe it happens with plants too, and humans. And the more we know about the science of communication between species, within species, across species, between plants and animals, between animals and animals, between us and them, the more we know about the depth and the complexity of that communication, it's always out there, it's always going on, the more real that becomes to us. I think there's no phrase for that I could find. That probably is in indigenous cultures, perhaps in some Eastern religions. I haven't found precisely that. So I like to name things, so I called it the habitat of the heart. That place between us, that place between the boy and the dog, where he lost his heart or found it. I think that there are two habitats. There is the physical habitat that we spend so much time working so hard to protect, as we should. And then there's this other habitat, the habitat of the heart, that we spend very little time talking to our kids about, teaching young people about, teaching ourselves and each other about, sensing, knowing, that habitat of the heart that we share with all living things. Here's the thing. Those two habitats, the physical habitat and the habitat of the heart, if one of those habitats goes, so does the other one. I think it's the work of our generation and the work of you, your profession, of educators, of health professionals, of journalists, of scientists, to explore both of those habitats and to protect both of those habitats and to nurture them and to grow them. I think that that is the future, to a degree, of environmentalism, if it is to finally move people from knowledge to action. Thanks for having me speak to you. I'm looking forward to when we have a session where I can hear some of the things that you have to say too. Thanks again. And thanks for your work, which in the broadest sense of the word, I consider sacred. Thanks.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Richard. Muchas gracias. Voy a aprovechar de contarles a la audiencia. Tenemos saludos de todos lados, de Buenos Aires, de Brasil, de Ecuador, de Bogotá, desde Oaxaca, México, en Chile, desde Temuco, Valdivia, del Valle de Choapa, Villarrica, Puerto Octay, Lautaro. Tenemos audiencia desde toda Latinoamérica, 5 países, distintas regiones. So I was saying, Richard, that we have 5 different countries sending you a lot of greetings, thanks, very thankful about your very inspirational talk. And now Gonzalo have collected some of the questions and he will start the conversation.
Gracias, Richard. La verdad, los comentarios que hay en el chat son realmente emocionantes. There are really exciting people commenting the chat of your presentation. Inspiradora, hope, con mucha esperanza. You bring our audience a lot of hope on the future. Estás trayendo mucha esperanza al futuro. Voy a comenzar con preguntas sobre el contexto actual. Lo mencionaste en la charla sobre un año de COVID-19. I'm going to start with one question about the context of COVID-19. This strange year in which we lived locked in, and how we can use this opportunity to reconnect in a different way, probably, with children and nature after this strange year in which we have been locked in. What are your thoughts about this?
Thank you. That's a great question, and we need to attend to that question much more than we have been recently. In the United States, and I think this may be true in some of the 5 countries that are represented here. When people are in seclusion, when they're locked into their houses because of the pandemic, as I said in the presentation, we realize what we're missing suddenly, even though we didn't miss it before, perhaps, at least not consciously. I wrote a piece for the LA Times, an op-ed recently, and I quoted lots of people who suddenly were looking out the window. They couldn't go out there. They had to stay away from people. And in their isolation, they were lonely. And they looked out the window, and some of them realized for the first time there were actually birds outside the window. And they looked at them and they began to have a relationship with them. One woman described how her son discovered an owl in a tree outside the window. And she described how her son would look at the owl and the owl would look at her son. And it comforted him and it comforted her. That discovery that many people are having of the nature right outside the window is extraordinarily important. Many cities, of course, you've read the accounts that they looked out into the streets and suddenly there were animals in the streets that they'd never seen before. Often they were predators, large predators, walking down the middle of the roads.
Richard,
Yeah.
sorry.
Just a second to translate.
We need to do some translation. So we're going to do something in Spanish and then you continue. Sorry.
Okay.
No, solamente para traducir a la audiencia en español, hablamos de la experiencia del lockdown y dice que es una muy buena experiencia como para entender qué fue lo que perdimos, darnos cuenta de lo que había afuera y cuenta alguna historia de que por primera vez nos ponemos a mirar por la ventana en nuestras casas y nos damos cuenta de que hay pájaros afuera y generamos una relación con el exterior que antes no existía, que él había escrito una columna en un diario en Los Ángeles efectivamente sobre eso. Cuenta también la historia de la relación entre un niño y un búho, cómo se miraban entre ellos y ese descubrimiento y la sensación de confort que genera este encuentro que se genera con estos animales. Incluso las historias que se han visto en los últimos años de animales predadores grandes que han circulado por las calles. También como han sucedido unos nuevos tipos de encuentros con la naturaleza en el fondo en este contexto. Okay, Richard.
I'll speak in shorter pieces now. I was talking about the animals in the street that suddenly people noticed. It turns out that many of those animals were in the city already. When animals come into cities, and this is happening more and more around the world, certainly it's happened in the United States, as the border between where wild animals live and where we live becomes thinner, they're moving into cities. When they do that, the diurnal animal that makes its living during the day becomes nocturnal often. So during the pandemic, they woke up and they came out because nobody was out there. Humans had gone away, and so they were present. I think in seeing those animals, those moments, we see a kind of future that could be in which we live in symbiosis with other animals and with nature itself.
Sí, y siguiendo un poco con la historia de los predadores y los animales que empezaron a salir a las calles durante la pandemia, dice que, claro, no nos dimos cuenta que ya estaban estos animales, ya existían, vivían en los alrededores, que esta barrera entre los animales, entre la naturaleza y la ciudad, entre los animales salvajes y la ciudad, empieza a volverse cada vez más delgada. Y que, claro, ya los humanos ya no estaban en las calles y por lo tanto los animales comenzaron a salir. Entonces, que él ve que en un futuro próximo se va a comenzar a generar, en la medida que vayan creciendo los límites urbanos, se va a empezar a generar esta simbiosis entre animales y humanos en contexto incluso urbanos. No sé si pasamos a otra pregunta.
Thank you, Richard. Muchas gracias, Richard. We have a lot of other questions. I'm going to go for a second one. Voy a hacer una segunda pregunta que tiene que ver con cómo ves tú el rol de los huertos escolares, de los huertos educativos, de los huertos que generamos en nuestras plazas o en nuestras escuelas, como un mecanismo para conectar estudiantes, profesores, niños con la naturaleza. The second question is, what is the role that you think green gardens, small orchards, school orchards, or park orchards, gardens could do to make this connection with between teachers, students, parents, and nature?
I can mainly speak for the experience in the United States, and I don't know that that's shared, broadly in other countries, but I think some of it is. As I said in the presentation, the United States has been going in the wrong way, in the wrong direction for quite a while. Canceling recess, not valuing outdoor education. Now, one of the effects of the pandemic is that suddenly outdoor education, outdoor classroom looks pretty good. You can socially distance outdoors more than you can in a classroom where the ventilation system is passing germs around the school. We need to socially distance ourselves 6 feet at least from other people. You can do that in an outdoor classroom much easier. That's one of the reasons it's getting more attention. Ironically, in 1915, during the great tuberculosis epidemic, people understood that. There were outdoor classrooms all over the United States. There were outdoor classrooms on the roofs of high-rise buildings in New York City. We understood that then, but somehow we've forgotten it. And now it's very hard to get the schools to do that. It's happening here and there, but that's one of the things that is getting our attention. And I'll stop talking, but I do think that there are great benefits both to the students and to the teachers for having more education outdoors. And it seems to be growing, at least in the preschools. There's been a big upsurge in the last few years of nature preschools, not so much in the higher grades.
Ok, thank you, Richard. Richard nos cuenta un poco y haciéndose cargo de que él conoce más cercanamente solo la experiencia de Estados Unidos, de que, bueno, las cosas en su país en general se han estado haciendo en una mala dirección, dice, ¿cierto? Que no han ido incorporando temáticas de educación al aire libre o relación con huertas, pero que paradójicamente durante la pandemia ha sucedido de que se ha vuelto a valorar la educación al aire libre, porque hay mayor ventilación, se puede permitir las cosas de distanciamiento, y hace el paralelo con lo que pasó alguna vez en Estados Unidos en una gran pandemia de tuberculosis en 1950, en donde las salas salieron afuera, se empezaron a hacer actividades al aire libre, pero de alguna forma eso se entendió y se fue olvidando con el tiempo, y ha sido cada vez más difícil sacar a los niños del aula. Y dice que sin duda esto hay investigación que ha probado que tiene muchos beneficios, no solamente para los estudiantes, sino que también para los profesores, y que lo que ha visto en los últimos años es que sobre todo en el ámbito preescolar, en el ámbito de educación parvularia, digo, se ha ido generando cada vez más escuelas o jardines infantiles al aire libre, de naturaleza, pero que no se ha visto el mismo movimiento en niveles superiores.
What would you advise for the teenagers? As you said, in preschool education, we have moved in this, probably more in this direction of having more contact with nature. But teenagers have been not so easy in the, at least in the school system, no? And probably we have also some gap at the university level. What would you advise for giving this opportunity to also to teenagers?
First, I want to say that last question focused more on gardens than I did on food production through schools. That is part of that connection to nature in schools. It's extraordinarily important. In the United States, there's a big surge of, even though we've been going in the wrong direction, there's this counter movement toward gardens at schools, on school grounds, toward green schoolyards, often not only schoolyards that are used by the students, but for the surrounding community on weekends, particularly if the surrounding community is involved with the design of that natural schoolyard and that garden that can become a community garden. In terms of the older students, that's true. You see a real drop off around 11 or so. You see a drop off, teenagers get interested in a different kind of biology that they seem to find at the shopping malls more than they do in nature. I think that is changing though. I think, we can only have so much technology in our lives. I remember going with my grandmother in Independence, Missouri, and holding her hand when I was a little kid. And she would stop in her tracks and she would point up at the sky and she says, "Richie, there's an aeroplane," not airplane, aeroplane. She was born in the late 19th century. To her, aeroplanes were amazing. They were new. To me, I barely look up. I think teenagers, as they get older, are far more used to, they have less awe in some ways of computers than people my age do, because it's still novel to us, but not to them. What's novel is nature. What's novel is outside. During the pandemic, one of the things we've noticed, and this is a little bit mixed, the people who are flocking now to the parks, flocking to the trails, crowding in, sometimes not in a good way. They're leaving trash, etc. Those are often young adults. Those are often millennials. You don't see very many kids, young kids out there with their parents, though. I don't know what it's like in your countries, but in the United States, Halloween was kind of stolen by young adults, by adults. It used to be just for kids. This experience we're having now with the pandemic, people rushing into nature, we worry that kids are actually having less contact with nature during the pandemic because of all the fear. But young adults are out there in greater numbers than they perhaps have been. So I don't think it's impossible to turn that around at all.
Thank you.
Hizo una pregunta Gonzalo respecto de qué pasa con los adolescentes, qué pasa con esa edad que, si bien ha crecido el movimiento de los huertos y de actividad del aire libre, qué pasa para mover a los adolescentes. Bueno, el primero hizo un punto de que, claro, la actividad al aire libre, hay un movimiento grande de huertos, de preocupación por los jardines, de hacer escuelas verdes, que no involucran solamente a los miembros a los profesores y estudiantes, sino que también a la comunidad, que se vuelven jardines comunitarios, haciendo un punto tratando de complementar lo anterior. Y luego habla de que, claro, puede haber a la edad a partir de los 11 años empieza a haber un cambio en los niños, pero que él cree también que esto está cambiando. Y cuenta la historia de una vez que él salió a caminar de la mano con su abuela en Missouri y de repente miraron al cielo y encontraron, y su abuela muy impresionada le dijo, mira, un avión, un avión. y completamente impresionada. Y él cada vez que mira al cielo y ve un avión como si nada. Le dice que puede pasar un poco lo mismo en el tema de la tecnología con las nuevas generaciones. Nacieron con ella, están acostumbrados, y lo novedoso o lo nuevo podría estar mucho más afuera que en la tecnología con la cual crecieron. Y que en ese sentido los adolescentes o los jóvenes se apropian mucho más de los lugares externos, más que los niños, que muchas veces están bajo el cuidado de sus padres, son los que en pandemia también han salido más, han estado más en los parques, han tenido una relación más grande con la naturaleza, un poco haciendo el punto de que no vería con tanta desesperanza los grupos jóvenes y adolescentes, sino que hay ahí también una oportunidad en esta nueva generación.
Gracias, Martín, por la traducción. Déjame hacer una pregunta para quizás conectar con dos temas que tú has mencionado. I'm going to ask a question that connect two different topics that you have already mentioned. La primera es esta idea de esta ecuación, ¿no? Entre más tecnología necesitamos más naturaleza. One is this idea of this equation in which if we have more technology, we need more nature. Que me parece que es muy interesante para pensarlo en la educación tanto de nuestros hijos como en la educación de los niños, ¿no? Because I think it's really interesting to think about it in the idea of how we educate children and in the schools. No, more technology, more nature we need. This equation esta ecuación que muchas veces está desequilibrada, ¿no? This equation that many times and more often is unbalanced, and we need to balance. Y la segunda idea, and the second idea that I want to realize, la segunda idea que me gustaría poner en discusión es esta idea de que la relación con la naturaleza nos ayuda a crear comunidades. That the relation with nature help us to build communities, actual communities between people. That is something that in many countries we are already missing. No? We need to go beyond ourselves, our families, and we need to build social trust. We need to build confidence between people. And this relation with nature help us in this idea of making communities. Entonces, preguntarte un poco cómo si puedes profundizar en esas dos ideas. If you can go a little forward in these two ideas of the equation, the balance, and how connection with nature make us more able to connect people also.
It's a great question. First, on the more high-tech we become, the more nature we need. I say that as a kind of equation because we have to repeat that to ourselves like a mantra. Parents need to remember that, remind themselves of that over and over again, because now it has to be a conscious decision. It won't happen unless it's a conscious act. That is true for teachers as well. It must be conscious. That's why I call it a budgeting issue of time and of money. Along those lines, it's very interesting that so many of the leaders in technology in, say, Silicon Valley, the Steve Jobs before he died, and Bill Gates, and so many of the others, they know this. Their kids are in nature preschools. You know, Bill Gates bought a lot of property in Washington that has a stream running through it and on Lake Washington, so his kids could have nature. And however, when you talk to them about this and say, and by the way, many of them have cabins in the mountains where they literally go to deprogram themselves to connect with nature so they can go back and be better programmers of technology. But when you talk to some of them and you mention this, is what about other kids? What about other people? Don't they need that nature too? It gets a little uncomfortable because their job is to move products, is to sell computers, sell technology, iPads, and all of that, particularly in the schools. So this idea of balance is imbalanced. They have it for themselves, but I think they need to be leaders now. I'm sorry, I'll let you translate. They need to be leaders in the Children of Nature movement.
Bueno, thank you, Richard. Respecto de la primera parte de la pregunta en esta ecuación tecnología naturaleza, mientras más tecnología, más naturaleza necesito, él habla de que lo pone en estos términos porque debería convertirse en un verdadero mantra para los padres, para los educadores, debería ser un acto consciente de, en el fondo, un acto consciente de balancear, de generar este equilibrio para, en el fondo, mirando esta idea de las mentes híbridas, ¿cierto? Y da un ejemplo de los líderes de Silicon Valley en tecnología, eh, que si uno se da cuenta, todos o los hijos de ellos están todas en escuelas verdes, en escuelas bosque, en escuelas con harto contacto con la naturaleza, y ellos también cuentan de que necesitan este contacto con naturaleza para poder volver y programar y ser más productivos. Y cuando se les hace la pregunta respecto de, bueno, ¿y qué pasa con el resto de los niños? Porque ellos lo que hacen es que están promoviendo la compra de nuevos aparatos, necesitan generar más tiempo en pantalla. Es una pregunta que los deja muy incómodos para el resto. Entonces, desde la perspectiva de Richard, estos mismos líderes tienen que ser quienes empiecen a promover este balance, balancear esta ecuación entre tecnología y naturaleza.
The second part of the question is one I'm actually most interested in. In fact, tomorrow I have to write an essay about the relationship between nature connection and democracy for a presentation I'm giving on Friday. I felt for a long time that in order to build a sense of community and then to build also a sense of democracy, you have to go outside. You have to go outside the front door as a kid. You have to know your neighbors. You have to go down the block. You have to see how things work, you know? And that is not only to go out and see how people are working, how people are dealing with their lives, but also how other animals and other life is part of our community. The concept of social capital is widely known. Why is it when we talk about social capital, which is the connections we have with each other and with other people in a community that supports us and them, why is it we only talk about one species? All of the animals around my house here in the mountains, the wild turkeys, the mountain lion that comes through, they're part of my social capital. Where I used to live, I'd look out the window from my office and I'd see lizards because we'd put native plants in our backyard. Lizards were coming in big numbers. And they'd be out there doing their push-ups. There was more posturing in my backyard than there was in the United States Congress. And they would make me laugh. That's part of my social capital. That makes me healthier to laugh. So I think this is one of the reasons why we're having so much trouble now. Our sense of loneliness, but also the decay in many ways of democracy, at least in the United States, that I think has to do with the fact we don't go outside much. We don't know our neighbors. Not only our human neighbors, we don't know our animal neighbors.
Y respecto de la segunda parte de la pregunta, en esta relación entre naturaleza y comunidad, dice que le interesaba mucho, que de hecho él tiene que hacer está preparando una conferencia sobre democracia y naturaleza, y en ese sentido habla de que es muy importante para el tema de la construcción de comunidad el hecho de salir afuera, de conocer. Y en ese sentido dice para uno construir comunidad necesita conocer a sus vecinos, necesita saber cómo las cosas funcionan, pero no solamente sus vecinos humanos, sino que también los no humanos, los animales, otras formas de vida que también forman parte de la comunidad. Y ahí él hace una mirada crítica al concepto de capital social. De cuando hablamos de capital social, ¿por qué solamente nos fijamos en una especie? Si es que los beneficios de esta relación, el capital social entendido como cuántos contactos tengo con otras personas, ¿por qué no pensar también en especies? Y él ponía un ejemplo de su oficina que tenía afuera y veía muchas pequeños lagartos, lagartijas, paseándose, que cosa que le provocaba mucha felicidad. ¿Y por qué eso no puede ser parte también del capital social que uno tiene, el contacto que tiene con otras especies? Y en ese sentido habla de que la relación que existe con este sentimiento de soledad, de aislamiento, es precisamente porque no salimos afuera, porque no conocemos a nuestros vecinos, tanto humanos como no humanos.
Thank you very much. Gracias, Martin. Thank you, Richard. I think we have like 5 more minutes of conversation. There are a lot of comments on the social media, and a lot of people are really appreciating your comments. Hay muchas personas que están agradeciendo tus presentaciones, tus ideas, tus comentarios, muy inspiradores. A lot of people saying how inspiring and with a lot of hope your words are. Mucha gente comentando lo inspiradoras y esperanzadoras que han sido tus palabras. Let me ask you one more question about the teaching. Una pregunta sobre los profesores. We here in Villarrica campus of Universidad Católica, nosotros en el campus Villarrica de la Universidad Católica formamos profesores. We have the responsibility of teaching teachers. So what would you advise us to do in this idea of training future teachers to be more engaged with nature and with the process of learning for their future children in this engagement with nature?
Well, first, in the United States, and again, I can't speak for other countries, but in the United States, one of the most important things I think that we need to do is to, in the universities and the colleges that train teachers, we need to start training future teachers how to take their students outdoors. In the United States, some teachers want to do this, but they don't know how. They've never done it themselves. Many of them are young, and their generation didn't go outside very much in nature, many of them. So they don't know where to start, even though they've read the studies, they know it's good for their kids, their students. So we need to train them. We can't assume they know how to do it, even when they want to do it. That's happening slowly in the United States. I hope some of your countries do it faster than we are. One of the things that we need to focus on too is why this is good for teachers. There's a really interesting study that was done in Canada several years ago, comparing teachers who could take their students outdoors to learn and the teachers who were kind of trapped in the classroom all the time with their students. And they found that the teachers who could take students outdoors to learn tended to burn out a lot less. They were less likely to burn out as teachers if they were able to do that. I think it's really important to communicate why this is good for teachers as well. Not every teacher is going to want to do it. But I think the more we relate this to the health also of the teachers and the health also of the parents, the more successful we'll be at connecting kids to nature, either in the classroom or at home.
Thank you. Bueno, Gonzalo hizo una pregunta respecto en específico de la formación de profesores. ¿Qué recomendaciones nos podría dar Richard para los que formamos profesores y cómo ellos van a influir en las futuras generaciones? Y él nuevamente habla desde la experiencia desde Estados Unidos, en donde, claro, uno de los puntos claves que desde sus organizaciones y que se ha discutido mucho es cómo podemos mejorar las condiciones en la formación de profesores para darle las herramientas a los profesores para que ellos puedan salir y puedan hacer actividades afuera. Muchas veces han leído muchos estudios respecto de lo importante que es, de los beneficios que trae, pero no saben cómo, no tuvieron la experiencia escolar relacionada con eso y tampoco, y nunca lo han hecho. ¿Cómo empiezo? ¿Por dónde parto? Son cosas que es necesario entrenarlas. Y él dice, las universidades tienen que hacerse cargo de entrenar a los profesores y que sean parte y que vivan esa experiencia. En Estados Unidos eso va despacio, dice que hay algunas iniciativas, pero no muchas todavía, pero que es algo que sin duda hay que poner hincapié. Y por otro lado, ¿por qué es bueno esto también para los profesores, no solo para los estudiantes? Ya habla un estudio en Canadá en el que se comparó a profesores que tenían actividades al aire libre y profesores que no, que hacían solamente sus clases al interior del aula. Y había una relación significativa entre aquellos que se quedaban dentro del aula que tenían una tendencia a verse más sobrepasados y tener estos momentos de colapso. Cuando se les preguntaba a los profesores que tendían a salir más, estos manifestaban que no tenían, o en menor medida tenían esto burnout, como se le dice. Y en ese sentido se hace un énfasis respecto de lo importante que es esto para la salud mental, no solamente de los profesores, sino que también de los estudiantes, por supuesto.
Ok, muchas gracias. Quiero ofrecerte, Richard, un minuto si quieres decir algunas palabras adicionales, una palabra de cierre. I want to offer you 1 minute if you want to do some closing remarks or closing thoughts that you have of this session.
Thanks. Several of the comments you've mentioned are about hope. I've been thinking about that quite a bit lately. This is not the most hopeful time in our history, is it? I think that even before the pandemic, many of us have been trapped in what I've called the dystopic trance. We have become addicted to despair long before the pandemic. There's good reasons for despair. Environmental despair, perhaps in particular. But what's the antidote to that? I like to say that, there's no practical alternative to hope. Despair gets you only so far. Martin Luther King in the United States said in different words and demonstrated that any movement, any culture will fail if it cannot paint a picture of a world that we'll want to go to, of a future we'll want to build. We fail if we cannot paint that picture. In my culture, in my country, I've noticed over the last few years that when I ask people to conjure pictures in their mind and tell me what they see in the far future, almost always those images look a lot like Blade Runner or Mad Max. They're post-apocalyptic images. What happens to a culture when it can no longer come up with images of a wonderful future? What happens to that culture? It's said you have to be careful what you wish for, you just might get it. We have to be careful what we imagine about the future because we just might get it. I think one of the most important things that teachers can do now is to help their students and themselves practice what I've called imaginative hope. What does a great future look like? What does a nature-rich future look like? What do our cities look like? What if our cities were filled with nature? What if our schools were filled with nature, with gardens? What if the homes we lived in, and many of you live in homes like this, were filled with nature in them and around our workplaces? What if biophilic design, which is being practiced more and more on workplaces, design was used to design where we work. When you incorporate nature into workplaces, people are more productive, sick time goes down, turnover gets better. What if we could do that with entire cities? If somehow we can engage students and ourselves in imaginative hope, it gives us a chance to actually build a future that people will want to go to. If we don't do that, we will remain captured by despair. And again, teachers, I think, are the most important people to help us escape from that trance of despair that we are in.
Bueno, y como unos comentarios finales, Richard nos habla un poco de este tránsito hacia la desolación, hacia la desesperanza que se ha visto imaginándose un poco futuros bien desoladores, en particular la desesperanza ambiental con las predicciones científicas que hay respecto de cambio climático, pérdida de la biodiversidad. ¿Hay algún antídoto para esto? Se pregunta, ¿tenemos alguna solución? Directamente no, no hay una solución médica, y él cita también unas palabras de Martin Luther King que dicen más o menos que se ha demostrado que todas las sociedades que no son capaces de imaginar su futuro tienden al desastre, tienden a fallar. Entonces el problema es un poco que no somos capaces de imaginar ese futuro. Y en general, cuando él le pregunta a adolescentes, por ejemplo, cómo ven el futuro, muchos dan algunos contextos parecidos a Mad Max, por ejemplo, o temas post-apocalípticos. Entonces estamos imaginando o estamos creando una imagen de un futuro muy desolador. ¿Qué pasa entonces si tenemos que tener mucho cuidado con lo que imaginamos? Pues en el fondo, ¿cómo hacemos para que tengamos algunas imágenes del futuro más esperanzadoras? Y él habla ahí de un concepto muy importante que se puede utilizar en los profesores, los mismos padres, que habla de la esperanza imaginativa, de cómo podemos imaginarnos futuros más esperanzadores. ¿Qué pasa si las escuelas fueran más verdes, si tuvieran más naturaleza? ¿Qué pasa si nuestras casas fueran ambientes en los que estuviera más insertada la naturaleza? Los ambientes de trabajo, habla de ambientes más biofílicos. ¿Y por qué eso no lo podemos traspasar incluso a las ciudades? Y eso depende un poco también de qué capacidad tenemos de imaginarnos futuros que tengan estas características. Se ha probado mucho en los ambientes de trabajo que cuando tienen más relación o son más biofílicos, aumenta la productividad, aumenta el compromiso. Entonces es una cosa como habla él, de engagement, ¿cierto? De compromiso, de generar un verdadero compromiso respecto de cómo nos imaginamos nuestros lugares y cómo somos capaces desde nuestras propias expertise y talentos poder ir cambiándolo.
Muchas gracias. Quiero agradecerle a todas las personas que han estado conectadas durante esta sesión y agradecerle muy especialmente a Richard la extraordinaria presentación y conversación que hemos tenido. I want to thank you, Richard, for this extraordinary presentation and conversation that we had. Really, really inspiring, and to all the people who have been following us by the social media. Thank you for being with us today. We hope in the future you will be able to come to Chile and to Villarrica. We have a lot of different things that you can share with us in the future. So thank you very much for your presence and your inspiring words.
Muchas gracias, Richard.
It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, we will wait for you here in Villarrica after all this pandemic transit that we are living on. And we queremos decirle a toda la audiencia que todavía está en vivo que por favor, ahora tenemos un receso de almuerzo. A las 15 horas volvemos a tres paneles concurrentes que ya fueron presentados en la mañana. Pueden ingresar a través de programa.ciets.cl. Les recuerdo que son temáticas relacionadas con enfoques interdisciplinarios para la educación, inter y transdisciplina, otros temas relacionados con otro panel con monitoreo de fauna, humedales y áreas verdes, y el sexto panel, que se transmitirá también en paralelo, es sobre problemáticas medioambientales locales. Los esperamos entonces a las 3 de la tarde y seguimos en el segundo Congreso Internacional de Educación para el Desarrollo Sustentable.